Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining Dorsey Ross on this episode of The Dorsey Ross Show. In this episode, Dorsey interviews another special guest that will give you hope and inspire you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us on another episode of the Dorsey Ross podcast. Today we have Dr. Michael Jacquith, who is a PhD chemist who left the corporate world and now helps men everywhere discover how to escape addictions and live a more meaningful and fulfilling life. Certified through the Life Coach School with specialization in addiction, he combines cutting-edge science and coaching expertise with the time-honored teachings of the faith. Michael is married with 6 children and lives in rural northern Idaho. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today.
Dorsey, it is a pleasure to be here. I'm excited for this conversation.
Awesome. What does a day in the life of Michael look like?
Well, I think one of the biggest things people might be surprised, well, maybe not surprised, but the 6 children part plays a big part of that role. And so we have 6 children from ages 2 to 11. And a day in the life of Michael looks like a lot of awesomeness happening. We get up early in the morning. I go to the gym. My wife and I both work from home. And so we kind of balance working from home with just engaging with the kids. We homeschool and really enjoying where we live.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your family and maybe even a little bit about how you got started with what you do? Was it something that, growing up, was it something that this is what you wanted to do in your life, or how did that get started as well?
And, I wish I could say this was something I grew up wanting to do, but not remotely. I grew up in a pretty abusive family in northern Michigan, and I decided I wanted to escape where I came from. And so I worked very hard. I actually worked my way up through a PhD in chemistry, went off to corporate world, did a lot of work and big research, and really felt this tug from God that I wasn't supposed to stay there in the corporate world. And don't get me wrong, there's great benefits to working for those kind of places. But as God slowly unveiled his plan in my life, one of the things I realized, I loved so much these meaningful conversations with other men. How do we grow? How do we develop? How do we become a better person? And eventually it took a lot of, kind of manipulations and a couple of good swift kicks to the behind. But I ended up leaving behind that corporate job and all of its yummy benefits and going entrepreneurial. And I can tell you, honestly, Dorsey, it would shock my parents if you told them when I was young that I would one day be an entrepreneur. They'd be like, no way, there's none of that. My wife's the exact opposite. Her parents knew she was going to be an entrepreneur from the first time she tried to sell her baby bottle off to another baby. But for me, nothing at all that way. But here we are,
Yeah.
And I love what I get to do.
Awesome. And I think that, there needs to be more talk between men and talking about different things that maybe we struggle with and that we deal with. A lot of us don't do that.
That's so true. It's don't take this the wrong way, but it is a hard time to be a guy in some ways. It's really hard because a lot of the things guys struggle with have either been really shamed or really washed aside, and we're told they're not a problem at all. A great example of that is pornography. And it's almost like there's this great divide. Half the culture wants to say, there's nothing wrong at all with pornography. And the other half the culture wants to say, you're a horrible person if you even think about looking at it. And so in that gap, how do you have a real conversation about what is an actual problem that affects something like 70+% of men in this country? That's a tough spot.
Right. And I know a few, men that have dealt with it. And, I've stumbled across it, and whatnot, in texting and Google and whatnot. But, friends of mine have said to me, Dorsey, be thankful that you have not had to have an addiction to that topic or to that, issue of pornography.
Absolutely.
And, I'm sure there's, people have all types of ideas and all types of, ways of doing things. But with you and, how you deal with it and with you talking to men about it, what advice would you give them to deal with that issue of addiction to pornography and how to overcome it?
I think the first thing we have to all start is by understanding that it is an addiction. Now, I've read a fair bit of the literature regarding, say, cocaine, and the way that cocaine affects your brain is very well characterized. What pornography does is even worse than what cocaine does to you. Now, I've never actually had cocaine. It's probably the best. I think I might like it a bit too much, if you know what I mean. But the way that pornography twists your brain is even worse. And so the first thing we have to do is we have to get a real clear picture of what's going on. But the next thing we have to do is we have to stop what I call the shame cycle. And the shame cycle exists in lots of different behaviors that we don't like. I'll use a silly example. Like maybe I have a problem with overeating, and I go and I bake a whole tray of brownies and I eat the whole tray. What do I say to myself? Oh, I'm a horrible person. Only a horrible person would eat a whole tray of brownies. I'm going to go check to see if there's any potato chips to make myself feel better. And you see, there's this cycle we get into. It's the same thing with pornography. It's the same thing with alcohol. We get into this shame cycle. And to stop that shame cycle, we have to flip the whole problem on its head and actually learn to love and care for ourselves and to recognize the deeper factors going on in terms of why we are where we are.
And from your experience, if you can tell us, what are some of those factors that, men deal with that may go into that addiction of pornography?
So many problems go back to childhood. And before I go into that, I want to start by saying that all parents are human. I myself am a human being. I'm a parent. I guarantee you I'm making mistakes with my children. So I'm not trying to indict any parents listening right now. We all do it. But instead to recognize that the basic needs a human being has are oftentimes in some way or another not met. Now let's make this specific to men. Men, like everyone, want to feel loved, want to feel wanted and important. But in our culture, the only way that men are officially okay to feel loved is through sexual contact. Like it's okay for a woman to feel loved through all these different ways. But when we look at, Indiana Jones, we look at any of the Hollywood role models, when the man feels loved, it's when he's having sex, right? Well, so here I'm a guy. I don't feel loved. I feel unwanted. I feel rejected. What else am I supposed to turn to? Like, maybe I'll try talking to a real girl, but odds are, if you're like me at all, I was never very good with the ladies, Dorsey. Like, don't tell my wife. I think I snuck past her guard somehow, right? And so here I am. I'm unloved. I'm unwanted. The only way I know how to feel loved is through sex, and my wife's not doing it. The rando ladies aren't an option or aren't doing it, and so I turn to pornography. And what's so stinky and so pernicious about pornography is the first time you do it, you get that huge dopamine hit. Just so massive. Like the amount of dopamine that your brain releases that is just off the charts. But then as you keep doing it, it gets worse and worse. And you actually deaden yourself to normal. And so to the point now, we have an epidemic in this country, Dorsey, of young men who are unable, literally physically unable to perform with a real human female their own age, because they're so addicted to pornography that their brain no longer functions with a real human girl anymore.
How does that fit in with faith and Christianity? And, I think a lot of us, in the Christian faith, we, especially with pornography, we put it almost, when it comes to it, because we in the Christian faith, we see pornography as a sin. But we put it up on a higher level than all the other things that we deal with and that we look at. How do we, as Christian men and Christian pastors and all, everybody else, how do we, how should we come around those that are dealing with that addiction and help them?
I think the first thing we need to do, especially as Christians, and I have to confess, Dorsey, a lot of us Christians do a poor job of this, is to separate out the sin from the sinner. And you're absolutely right. Right now, pornography in particular is just deemed such a horrible, horrible thing. But through most of the history of the church, it was not deemed so. Through all of church history, the worst of the sins was pride. It wasn't lust. In fact, lust, Dante only put lust as the second out of 7 circles of hell. And the reason why is that the church fathers did not view it the way that we moderns do. Moderns consider, especially modern Christians, consider a sin of lust to be just unforgivable, just so horrible. So you have an affair, whatever, all these different sins of lust. But the ancient church fathers, while they acknowledged that those sins were grave and serious, would not have put those worse than the sin of pride, worse than the sin of envy, and a number of other things, right? And so first we have to acknowledge is that while it's grave, we don't have a healthy perspective of it as a whole as Christians. And the right way is to separate the sin, which is objectively wrong from a Christian standpoint, from the sinner who's still a beloved child of God. And that's so hard with these just charged issues about sexuality, and people's emotions are so high. And so many wives and the men I work with are threatening to leave the marriage over this. And I don't mean to indict them, but that's not the Christian response to any sin. And particularly a sin like this is one that's not served by threatening. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
It does. It definitely does. To move on from a little bit more and to get to talk to you about other topics here, how do men get more control in their lives, and what exactly does control look like, for us as men?
What's so funny about Dorsey is this word comes up almost with every single guy I work with, the word control. And the biggest thing about control is we have to go back to the beginning. In the beginning, man was designed to have full control over himself. Adam and Eve in the garden, they're rocking it. Everything's in control. They each control how they show up. All of a sudden, there's this event with an apple, and now something's gone wrong. And shoot, I'm not in control anymore. What do? I try to blame and control her. I try to blame and control God. And this control inverts from being controlling myself, which just failed, by the way, to now controlling others around me. And so then you read a book, say like David Goggins, who I love, or Extreme Ownership, and this idea of saying, I have to be responsible for everything. I control it all. And there's a core of truth in there, but most people twist that core. And here's what it's supposed to be. I do have the ability, with great practice and effort, to control how I show up. But everything else, every outcome, every final result is in the hands of God. And all I do is control how I show up. And when we surrender that sense of control of the outcome, we discover the possibility to have the control God made us for of ourselves.
Yeah, and you're right. We have to, surrender that control, or surrender that issue that we're dealing with over to God. And sometimes, whatever that may be, it's not easy to, surrender it to Him, or if we do, we take that control because we're afraid of what might happen, or we're afraid of, maybe like what God might do with it, or how God may handle it.
Absolutely.
How can men make real changes to long-term struggles?
I think the biggest thing as guys, we have to understand, we like this idea, when I work on a car, right? Maybe my car has an O2 sensor that goes bad. What do? I buy a nice O2 sensor. I take apart the pieces. I get to it. I swap the sensor up. Problem solved. Finito. Done. Human beings and our brains don't work quite that simply. And so when you're telling me, look, Michael, I've got a history of being too mean to my children, maybe. I'll pick a common one. A lot of dads are really upset with how mean they are to their kids. I say, cool. You're not going to just swap a part out and move forward. First thing we're going to do is we're going to really slowly dig down what's going on underneath that. Most of the time for men, loud, flashy, anger kind of behavior has a wound that's hiding beneath that. And that wound, a psychological wound, Dorsey, is different than a physical wound. Like if I have a cut in my arm, right, it hurts, it bleeds a little bit, then it heals. And more or less, most of the time, I go back to being normal. But a psychological wound can stay there for decades. And even when you start to heal it, it can still affect how we live our lives. And so what I mean by that, if I want to make a long-term change, I have to two steps. Number one, I have to be willing to dig down to find that underlying wound or wounds. Sometimes there's many, and really bring those out and start to work on healing for those. But number two, I have to become cognizant and aware that going forward, I'm going to have triggers. Even as I heal those, I'll still be sensitive to things that remind me of that original wound. And so maybe it comes from some issue in my past about disrespect. And so when my kids act disrespectful, it triggers me. And I have to learn, this isn't going to be one and done kind of a fix. For most of the rest of my life, I will be aware of what I need to do when this sort of triggering event occurs. And this pattern behavior change combined with a deep introspection and ultimately surrendered for healing really can make a difference, but it's not a grip. You don't just will it and grip, white knuckle, force things to be better. That never works.
Yeah. And you're talking about your past and how to deal with that, and dealing with it throughout your life. If I'm understanding you correctly, with your history of when you were younger, being sexually abused and everything, how did you over time? How did you deal with that? And if people are listening who have been abused, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever, what advice would you give, to them to deal with it or to talk to somebody about that issue in their life?
The first thing I would say, Dorsey, is don't assume that the problem is solved when you run away from it. And I glanced over that part very quickly when in my story, but let me expand on that a little bit. I hated the life situation I grew up in. There was sexual abuse present. There was everything present. It was just an always bad. And my dad ended up going to jail for 10 years in sixth grade. And so I said, screw all that. I jettisoned on the faith. I pursued the church of hedonism, I call it, chasing pleasure. And I ran from all that. And I assumed that the fact that I got out of there physically meant that I was done with where I came from. And nothing could have been further from the truth. It wasn't until I got married and started having children of my own that I all of a sudden confronted my father again inside of me. And I realized that I was doing the things that he had done that I hated so badly. And so I think the first thing I need to tell people is if you come from this background, there's wounding and baggage that needs to be dealt with, even if you don't see it. And it may not come out until the time that you really don't want it to. So start early. Like it's not a matter of, oh, I feel fine right now. Maybe you do. That's awesome. Praise the Lord. But the wounds are there. But number two, you need somebody to work through this stuff with you. We aren't made to do this alone. Like if you break an arm, no one would hesitate to go to a doctor and help have the bone sent, put a cast on it. That we would just do that. I won't be like, oh, I will fix my own arm. Watch her. Like we would never do that with a broken arm. But we do that exact thing with a broken spirit, with a psychological wound, with an emotional wound. We're like, it's fine. I'll just fix it. Doesn't work. But here's the problem, Dorsey, and I'll say this as loving as I can. There's a wide array of therapists, coaches, and specialists that try to help people. And not everybody fits with everybody. And it's not like a general doctor. Generally, if you have a broken arm, most doctors can take care of you. That's not how the psychological realm works. And it's very common, I'm sad to say this, that you will have to go through 3, sometimes even 10 different therapist coaches till you find the one that's able to help you shift the needle. Sometimes that's a personality mismatch. Sometimes that's a skill set mismatch. Sometimes people just need a different approach than somebody else. And so if you're in this spot, don't despair. Keep searching. Find that person who can help you because it's super embarrassing. But it's also the only way to find that way to actually finally heal this part of your life that's going to eventually drag down everything else if you don't confront it.
Right. It's interesting. You mentioned about the broken arm. When I was back in Bible college, I fell one day and I broke my arm. And a friend of mine said to me, "Oh, Dorsey, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." Not realizing that I actually had broken my arm.
Right.
And until 3 days later, when I woke up and my arm, was swelling, like twice the size of my arm, normally was. And I was like, and then I realized by looking at it, I was like, I have to go to the hospital.
Right. It's such a great example because it's so easy to see that on the outside and it's so hard to see it on the inside. But here's what's even worse is nobody wants to confront it inside because we're worried about what that message that might send to others if they found out. And there's no shame in having a broken arm. You got a great story. I can even imagine your story right now. You see, I was going for the big catch in the end zone, or it was the huge fish. It was such a big fish. It pulled me out of the boat and I broke my arm in the water. There's a story. But the story for an emotional wound isn't that glorious. We don't want to share that. We don't want people finding out about that. And we're embarrassed that we'll be judged if they find out. And we're embarrassed that maybe it can't be fixed. Maybe the wound is too deep. And this is how the devil gets us right there.
How did you talked about walking away from the faith. How did you come back to the faith and come back to your relationship with Christ?
That's a good story. The best answer to that in one word is stubbornly. I'm that sort of guy where like, for 12 years, I kind of knew what the truth was. But like, Augustine, writes, Lord, give me chastity, but not yet. That was my prayer for many, many years. And I met when I was in ninth grade a man named Paul. Ironically, I didn't think of it ironically at the time. And Paul had a zealous faith. And he and I shared two loves. We loved the outdoors and we loved to argue. Those two go very well together when you live in northern Michigan. And for 12 years, we did a ton of stuff together. Like even going through college and graduate school, we stayed close to each other. And the 12th year, he said to me, Michael, I've noticed you've stopped arguing and are just asking questions to clarify. But even then, Dorsey, I wasn't backing yet. I'm way more stubborn. Like the good Lord knew what he had to work with. So let me set the stage for you here, okay? There's this one particular day. It's spring, and I've been going back to church for a little while. I'm like kind of feeling that tug, but still fighting it. And I pull into the church parking lot, all right? It's Sunday morning. And I'm just kind of saying, for Lord, if you're real, if you're out there, give me some sign I'm supposed to do this, like, because I feel like I'm going to stretch this out forever. And I kid you not, Dorsey, I open the door to the church and imagine, probably 50 feet wide, this banner, this huge banner that reads, Repent Today. And it was like a 2x4 to the head. And it was like, bam, like, all right, I get it. Okay, all right, I'll do this thing. And then I decided to do it.
How does the Christian faith combine with modern psychology and coaching?
Well, it's really interesting, Dorsey, because so many people think that coaching has like this woo element or this spiritual element. And I think certainly to some coaches it may, but I think there's a much deeper level that when we look at the way God built the human being, God built us as both body and soul, and God built in this spiritual element and this physical element, right? And so what coaching does such a great job of is showing how the two connect. Showing that what we think, the power in our thoughts to create a reality of results around us. In one way, when we read in the Gospel of John that we were made in the image and likeness of God, I'm sorry, it's Gospel of John. We'll get to that in a second. In Genesis, we're made in the image and likeness of God. One way that God is creative. Now, I don't have the power to create a universe out of nothing, but I do have the power to create results in the real world based upon the words that go on in my head. And so I believe that life coaching is actually very, very deeply theological, and it explores some of the intrinsic ways in which man, speaking generically of men and women, are created in the likeness of God and share to a much smaller degree in his creative power. But we don't realize that. And so we use this power like a wrecking ball, and we allow negative thoughts, destructive thoughts to become patterns, to start causing repetitive, consistent problems in our life. And we throw up our hands and say, we don't know what to do. But the power is up in your mind, and everybody underestimates. You can read Joe Dispenza, author after author, talk about the power of your psychic mind to create things in the world, and they have to put a woo element to it. But I believe that those of us who are Christian have a far better and more consistent explanation with why the brain is so powerful, because of the spiritual element of the human being.
What role should emotion, empathy, and compassion play in a man's life?
I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I don't want to expand on it. This idea, I want to choose Indiana Jones. Like there's kind of really only two male role models. There's Harrison Ford and there's Homer Simpson. Right? And we're kind of covering the opposite ends of the spectrum here. Harrison Ford, what is he? He's calm, he's confident, he's cocky. He always gets the girl. He's able to succeed in every situation. He might have a tender moment right after having sex, but that's really about it. And there's Homer Simpson, utterly incompetent, can't accomplish anything he wants to do. Definitely never has a tender moment, except for maybe one time when he has screwed everything up himself and finally comes to realize it. But what you never see in any of these two characters is how humility and compassion and charity can be a great strength of man. And in general, I think that's something our society has lost sight of. And this is true both as a man regards himself and as a man regards others. If you want to create real healing in your life, you have to start by showing compassion and care and love to yourself. I mentioned earlier the shame cycle. It's so easy when I do something wrong. For a period in my life, Dorsey, I was addicted to pornography. And it was so easy. When you go and you click as a Christian, you're like, I'm the scum of the universe. I'm the worst guy ever. Only a horrible, horrible guy would ever go and do what I just did. There's no compassion there whatsoever. And the healing with that has to start with compassion for ourselves. But it's the same way when you want to talk about what I think real masculine strength is. It's the ability to be an integrated man, to go up to another man or a woman who's in pain and say, I see your pain. And I'm here and I will put my arm on your shoulder and I will support you through this pain. There are some good male friends of mine that I have put my arm around their shoulder around a campfire and they have sobbed into my shoulder. And that is a manly moment. I'm not trying to be in any way sexual here whatsoever. That is just pure compassion, pure connection of the heart. And it's a strength that I think we as men need to start gathering, start trying to fight for again. Even I'll choose another movie reference here, Braveheart. Here's a manly man, right? But even there, it's really hard for him to show just pure compassion. There's a few moments of it, but the movie really glorifies there's the physical torture scene at the end. There's the cute princess that he gets to go and sleep with. The movie glorifies those. And it only shows the littlest bit of what I think is the strength that allowed him to get all those guys to follow him in the first place. Without the rest of the crew, there would not have been a freedom movement.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that we need, as men, we need to have compassion for ourselves and show compassion to others as well.
It's so essential. But so many of us don't know how to do it. We don't have a great role model. Let's be honest. Most of our fathers never knew how to do it. I have so many clients, Dorsey, whose fathers we described as an old school tough guy. If there's some sort of cultural background, maybe it's an old school Italian tough guy or an old school German tough guy. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. Just put a different accent on it. You get the same thing across the board, right? And so then you pop a guy out who doesn't have this information anywhere, is hard pressed to find it. And here's actually one more perspective. I want you to consider for a second just how manly of a man Christ is because of the compassion he shows. One of my favorite scenes in the Bible, Dorsey, is when there's the woman who's caught in the act of adultery. And she's brought by the Pharisees before Jesus, right? Now, I want to pause just for a second. Let's put ourselves in this woman's position. This would be utterly terrifying. I've never had anyone intrude when I was in the act of physical intimacy with someone, but I can only imagine if I did, that's a bad start to that day. And then she's a woman, so she's even more embarrassed about it. And she's dragged, literally, she's probably naked, dragged out of that situation, shoved through the streets. How shameful. With the knowledge she's about to die. This woman, it must be in utter fear. And look at how Jesus, with the subtlest of touches, supports her, shows compassion to her, and then restores her dignity to her through this connection he forms where he's able to feel what he feels. And he never approves the sin. It's so important, guys, as we talk about this idea of connection and emotional contact. We never say something that is bad is actually good. His final words are, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. He forgives her, but never approves what's wrong. And our Lord repeatedly through the Bible shows this powerful emotional presence. When Lazarus dies and our Lord finds out that they say Jesus wept and he weeps so profoundly, the Jews remark about it saying, oh my gosh, this man must have loved Lazarus so much. And Jesus even knows he's about to raise him from the dead. And he still allows himself to feel that feeling in the moment. And as guys, that's what we got to do.
Amen. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show today. How can people, if they want to connect with you or get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Absolutely. Thank you for that invitation, Dorsey. So guys and gals out there listening, I have my own podcast. I'm a Catholic, but I work with Catholics and Protestants. I think at this point, what divides us is so much less than what unites us facing the assaults we're in the world. You can find me at Catholic Life Coach for Men. There's a podcast, Catholic Life Coach for Men, a website, www.catholiclifecoachformen.com. If you're at all curious about what I've got to say, I will offer a free 1 hour of my life with anyone who wants to sign up. We'll talk about what coaching is, what problems you might have, get crystal clear about what we can do. Come check it out. It's cost you nothing but an hour, and it might transform your life forever.
Thank you. Well, guys and girls, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, it's great to have you, and please check out Michael's website and Also, check out my website as well at www.dorseyrossministries.com, and hope you're encouraged by this. And until next time, God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you again for joining Dorsey Ross on this episode of The Dorsey Ross Show. Please like, share, and tell others about the show. Also, please check out the other podcast episodes. And if you would like, donate to this podcast and buy Dorsey a coffee. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.